Okay, everyone, I apologize for the delay. We had some trouble with our computer here. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Conversations Putting Research into Action. This will be a live conversation with Dr. Jeff Temple for discussion about his article entitled E-cigarette Use of Youth Adults, Motivations and Associations with Combustible Cigarette, Alcohol, Marijuana, and Other Illicit Drugs. My name is Robert Bush. I'm the Evaluation and Research Manager here at CADCA. And on the left here of the screen, we have Dr. Jeff Temple, who's joining us, a professor and licensed psychologist and director of the Behavioral Health and Research Department of OBGYN at UTMB Health. As far as introductions to Dr. Temple, he is at the University of Texas Medical Branch. His research, which has been funded through the National Institute of Justice, National Institutes of Health, and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, focuses on interpersonal relationships with a particular emphasis on the intersection between substance use and violence. He's an associate editor for the Journal of Primary Prevention, consulting editor for Psychology of Violence, and on the editorial boards of 4 other scientific journals. Dr. Temple recently co-chaired the Texas Task Force on Domestic Violence. With that, Dr. Temple, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And Robert, you'll let me know if for some reason the audio on my side is messed up, but I'll keep talking as if it's not. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone that's listening. We're going to talk today about the link between e-cigarettes and other substances, mainly focusing on that study that was published in the American Journal on Addictions, really why we should care about adolescent use of e-cigarettes and maybe e-cigarettes in general, and then what are the motivations underlying teens' use of e-cigarettes. All right, Robert, so am I the one, do I change it or do you change the slide? I don't think I have control over it. There we go. All right. So what are teens smoking? And really, so when I started the study, and I'm going to go over the study here in a little bit with a different slide, but it was in 2010, about 1,000 kids, over 1,000 kids throughout the Houston area, started when they were freshmen in high school, ethnically diverse, primarily urban population that we've been following annually. Since then, we're actually in our 8th year right now. We just finished our 8th year, looking at really the risk and protective factors of adolescent substance use and dating violence, really with the idea of identifying those shared risk and protective factors to then develop and implement a school-based program to make better kids and therefore make better adults. And one of the things that got me interested in e-cigarettes and what kids are smoking was I was actually at after the first year of our survey, I was in Washington, D.C. and happened to be at a rock concert, Manchester Orchestra, for those that are familiar. And it was sponsored by an e-cigarette company. And it started to remind me of a lot of the cigarette ads back in the 70s and 80s and how it was really trying to attract a younger generation and try to get them hooked so that they'll be lifelong smokers. So that's where I got interested in e-cigarettes and started to look at what other teens are smoking, including Hookah, which is this basically, if you could go to the next advanced slide, which is basically a form of smoking cigarettes, but it's through kind of a group effort at smoking cigarettes, and they have these hookah bars, different names as water pipe, shisha, hubbly bubbly, and I always feel like I'm aging myself when I do street names for drugs because they change so frequently, as you guys know that are in the business, and so I'm always careful about what I actually call stuff and ask adolescents what they call stuff before I say it and look stupid. So if you look at hookah statistics, this according to the National Youth Tobacco Survey. Hookah increased quite a bit for middle and high school students. You can see the past 30-day use, about 2% of middle school students and 7% of high school students, which both of those increased from the year prior. And that's it might not sound like a lot, 2 and 7% respectively, but when you start to look at that, extrapolate that from all the kids in the U.S., you're talking about tens of thousands of kids that are doing hookah, and then other things that kids are smoking. If you could advance the slide, Robert. We see that I can't remember if it's spice or synthetic marijuana. Again, I'm gonna age myself, and I'm sure it's called something else by now, even though we made these slides just a few weeks ago. But K2, fake weed, black mamba, skunk, and basically this is what, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's the sold in a lot of convenience stores, gas stations. Even though it is recently made illegal, it's still being sold in these stores, and they do it it's disguised as incense, basically, and that's how they get away with selling it. And it is basically marijuana, but they change one compound within the formula, so you never know if you're going to get nothing or if you're going to get a stronger form of marijuana or you're going to get something dangerous. I have a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. I hope that they don't smoke pot, but I would rather them smoke THC than synthetic marijuana, because at least with THC you mostly know what's in it. And again, I'm not condoning that. Synthetic marijuana is scary because of the unknown of it. You can see the percentage down there. This is from the Monitoring the Future study, and 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders range from about 3 to 5%. We actually did a study, and if you can advance the slide, Robert, we did a study where we looked at the relationship between synthetic marijuana and regular marijuana. And Robert, if you could, that's actually going back, so if you could move forward. We did one more forward. We looked at synthetic marijuana and then regular marijuana, cannabis. And what we found was that synthetic marijuana predicted the use of cannabinoids, marijuana use in adolescence. So basically, kids that were, and the other way around. So if in one year they were using one type of marijuana, synthetic or THC, the next year they're more likely to do the other, and that's controlling for their erstwhile use. So, and we can see in our study it was much higher than the Monitoring the Futures. You can see the synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic pot was about 12% in both the baseline and the follow-up years, whereas pot was about 30% and 38%, which is what we see with about national averages of pot. But I think the key takeaway of that study was that synthetic marijuana is a predictor of future THC use and vice versa. So then if you could move forward to the next slide, where we talk about salvia, which is basically an herb that it was a little more popular a couple of years ago. Miley Cyrus had a song about it, or mentioned that she was using salvia, so they got some pop culture influence. But it's basically mimics the effects of marijuana. It's and if you look at the rate of it, it's about 1 to 2% of 8th to 12th graders. But really what we were focused on, if you could go to the next slide, is this idea of e-cigarettes and cigarettes, and especially its relation to other forms of tobacco. And you can see that cigarettes, cigars, pipes, the rates there. One of the things that we've done a really, really good job, largely because of people on this call, is the reduction in combustible cigarette use over the past several decades. It's one of the few public health success stories. Really, I mean, if you look at how many kids don't smoke combustible cigarettes now relative to 10 years ago, relative to 20 years ago, it's pretty amazing. And it's probably the impact of several factors, one being the price, so increased taxes on it, increased price of cigarettes, less likely to afford them. One is the Truth Campaign commercial. That is one of the more successful public health commercials in terms of making cigarettes not look cool. And I can say that because adults were less influential in designing those, that they really listened to kids about how to design those commercials. And so it's been pretty effective at reducing the use of combustible cigarettes. And that's where, and if you could advance to the next slide, that's where I really worry about the contribution of e-cigarettes. Not so much e-cigarettes themselves is that I worry about. It's that how do e-cigarettes relate to combustible cigarettes? So we've done such a great job at reducing combustible cigarettes that now we're introducing e-cigarettes. And the problem is that if a kid uses e-cigarettes and then maybe because it doesn't have as much nicotine or any nicotine, or maybe it loses its appeal, that then they start to want to do cigarettes, and then we have another generation hooked on combustible cigarettes, and the lifelong fiscal and health consequences of smoking cigarettes then comes back into play after having 2 decades of cigarette use decreasing. So that's where this slide comes in, the next generation of cigarette for the next generation of addicts. And you can see this not just in, not just me talking, not just anecdotally, and I'll present the research here, but big tobacco is buying up these e-cigarette businesses, and they're now the ones that are in charge of it, and because they see the writing on the wall, right? In order, just like they did in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they wanted to, big tobacco wanted to hook teens, so therefore it's a lifelong revenue stream. And since that was no longer as effective, they're now jumping on this e-cigarette bandwagon to hopefully hook teens that way, and then get lifelong cigarette smokers and or e-cigarette smokers. And so this isn't me being conspiratorial. This is actually some of their plans in terms of making money. And if you could go to the next slide. So some of the common names of e-cigarettes are vaping, e-pens, e-pipes, e-hookah, e-cigars. The tricky thing about e-cigarettes is that they probably are better than cigarettes, better than combustible cigarettes. In fact, there's a lot of countries, England, for instance, has suggested that this is a good way to quit combustible cigarette use, to quit smoking. So they suggest this as a positive alternative, and that they cite very good research that shows that moving into e-cigarettes can help people reduce the use of combustible cigarettes. And since we think that e-cigarettes are probably less harmful than combustible cigarettes, that may be the right way to go. And I say think and probably there on purpose, because we don't know what's in them. Up until recently, there weren't any laws regulating these companies to tell us what was in these e-cigarettes, what was in the e-juices. So we kind of just had to take the company's word for it. And some of the stuff can be dangerous. And even though that law came into effect, it's giving a grace period before they have to be enacted. So we still don't totally know what's in e-juices. And then the second thing that makes it more and more complicated makes, I think, e-cigarettes more concerning, of course, is that if it gets kids hooked on e-cigarettes, and then that appeal fades, or they need more nicotine, and then they move into cigarettes, and then we see the lifelong problems. So if you could go to the next slide. So the e-cigarette prevalence, this is from the National Youth Tobacco Survey. You'll see from our study here in a second, ours is a bit higher, but I think the main takeaway from this slide is the increase in e-cigarettes over the past few years, both in middle school and high school students, from a little over 4% to 16% in high school students, and from just 1% to over 5% in middle school students have reported past use of e-cigarettes. So if you go to the next slide. And here's the regulations that I was speaking of a little bit ago. This was passed in 2016, where the FDA started to regulate e-cigarettes, hookah, and other cigarette-related products. So they're not allowed to be sold to persons under the age of 18, and they actually are requiring photo identification. This was less enforced prior to this law. They can't allow the selling of covered tobacco products in vending machines, and are not allowed to distribute free samples, which is really interesting, because that free sample, like mentioning that rock concert that I went to, that was part of it. So, and it's kind of the old marketing campaign of drug dealers, right? You give them the first product free and get them hooked, and then they come back for more. There's also part of that law is to let folks know what is in the e-juices. And one of the things that's an interesting byproduct and negative or positive of these new regulations is it's going to put a lot of the small companies that were vaping companies and e-cigarette companies out of business because they are not able to keep up with the regulations, cannot afford to study and report what's in all of their juices. That's good, but on the other hand, then it's going to be taken over completely by big tobacco, which has not been a faithful or very reputable advertiser of their products. So if you can move to the next slide. So you can see that they are very accessible. Like I mentioned at the concert, we got them now. Thankfully, they're not allowed to give them away for free anymore. But even with those regulations, it is still relatively easy. Actually, not even relatively. It is still extremely easy to purchase these products via the internet. You don't have to be of age. There's very little tracking that people can do. I mean, for that matter, you can buy OxyContin and a number of things over the internet, no matter what age you are. But I think it's especially easy with some of these products. If you can move to the next slide. So some of the risks. This is the next couple of slides are just kind of the maybe the less concerning part, but still something that we should be aware of. There is an increase from 2010 to 2014 in the number of poison center calls. That's pretty speaks for itself. This is involving kids under the age of 6 years old, so that a vaping pen is left around and the kid plays with it, maybe breaks it, and the e-juice spills on them, and that is it's rapidly taken in by the skin. So there is some danger there, and it's something that we should be aware of. And if you go to the next slide. So here's this liquid nicotine and some of the risks that are in it. Can be absorbed quickly if digested. And this was mentioned earlier, but it's mixed with unknown substances and flavorings that are enticing to youth and emerging adults. And we'll talk about some of the specific flavors in a second. And then what we mentioned before, that companies are not currently required to disclose all the ingredients. And really one of the scarier things is the unknown. We know with cigarettes, we know what they do. I mean, this research is probably one of the better researched areas in all of health, and we know the detrimental effects. E-cigarettes just haven't been around for very long, so we don't know the total effects of it. I mean, there's some people that are concerned about putting this liquidized oxygen, if you will, into your body, this vaping idea. So there's this thing called popcorn lung, where the microwave popcorn that you take out of the microwave and you put it on your face and you inhale it, that can actually cause damage if you do it repeatedly over and over again. It's called popcorn lung, and so there is some maybe minor concern over that type of ailment based on e-cigarettes. If you go to the next slide. So this is why you shouldn't carry an e-cigarette with you in your pocket. It's, again, very rare, but there was a couple stories not too long ago where I think this one in particular was 2016, where it exploded in a man's pants, and that's not something you want to happen if you're a man, or I guess a woman for that matter. So if you go to the next slide, Robert. So here's our study. So this is the one I mentioned earlier that we started in 2010 with over 1,000 kids, and we've been following them, first funded by the National Institute of Health. And then when the kids were no longer in high school, when most of them had graduated, we got funding from the National Institute of Justice to continue the study. And we're actually applying for a grant right now to extend the study by an additional 5 years. So that would be, we're at the 8th year, so it would be 13 years of data from when kids are first starting to partake in risky behaviors, first starting to date, all the way up to when they're married and have kids of their own. And so hoping that we can make this actually an intergenerational study. You can see that there's a pretty nice array of ethnicities, about 30% Hispanic, African American, and white. And you can see most of ninth graders at the first wave. You go to the next slide. And so what we did for asking about e-cigarettes is, since the last survey about 1 year ago, did you use electronic cigarettes, e-cigs, vapors? In the past month, how many days? What reasons motivated you to use e-cigarettes? And there is a bit of a problem with our study in that we listed out reasons for them rather than you leaving it open-ended and letting them tell us. We did that for basically because of the constraints of doing school-based and research and just time and money and getting kind of answers. So we did have a whole bunch of reasons, and we'll go over these in a second, but there's certainly other reasons that maybe that we didn't think of that could be motivating their use. And then we also asked about what the primary reason was, and then what flavor of e-liquid did they prefer. So if you could go to the next slide. And here's the kind of meat and potatoes of it, is that 28% of kids reported in the past year that they have used e-cigarettes, and though not significantly different, it was higher than traditional cigarettes. So this is kind of eclipsing combustible cigarette use, and I, not surprisingly, a lot of the same kids that were using cigarettes were using e-cigarettes. But this is telling. This is becoming more popular than traditional cigarettes. Next slide. And then the primary reason for use. So the most important, and I think the most concerning reason, is that they taste better than regular cigarettes. So 56% of kids said that one of the primary reasons for their use was that it tastes better. Used as a substitute for smoking, to avoid smelling like tobacco smoke, help cut down the number of cigarettes. So I can see that one being a positive answer. To help quit smoking, another positive. Save money, to avoid it exposing others to secondhand smoke. But then again, you see that the number one reason given was the taste. All right, if you go to the next slide. And then flavor of e-liquid reported, you can see that all of these are really not meant for an adult audience. So Pink Lady, lemonade, Skittles, watermelon, Captain Crunch, Orange Crush. These are not meant for adults. These are meant for kids, and that's not an accident. Again, going back to trying to recruit kids to smoke e-cigarettes and get them hooked, and then you have a customer for life. If you could press the next button, Robert, I was going to show you that I don't necessarily like the idea of e-cigarettes, but if you have cherry, and then if you press it again, you'll see that you'll have Mountain Dew, and then again, you'll have Skittles, and those are three of my favorite things. And so it's enticing to even a 41-year-old like me. Do you go to the next one? So the findings were that basically e-cigarettes were fairly common in our sample, mostly 17, 18-year-olds at this time, between 17 and 19. And a couple of things that we saw was really prevalent among males, and also Hispanic and Caucasian participants. So much so that it was the African Americans, I think it was about 12% of African Americans had smoked e-cigarettes, and over 30% of Hispanics and 30% of white participants had past year e-cigarette smoking. So that's quite a big difference. So when we talk about interventions, that it might not be as important of a concern in African American samples, that there still seems to be marijuana would be the focus there, whereas maybe with white and Hispanic students there should be a more sincere focus on cigarettes and e-cigarettes. you can see that the other major finding, it was significantly and positively linked to every substance use variable. So everything that we asked. So this is combustible cigarettes, of course, alcohol, marijuana, synthetic marijuana, prescription drug misuse, cocaine, hallucinogens. So basically every other type of substance you can think of. And this probably doesn't surprise anyone on this call, because we know that these risky behaviors cluster together. And especially when we look at substance use, we know that substance use clusters together in the sense that if someone does pot, they're likely to do drink alcohol, and maybe a little less so vice versa. But we do know that they cluster together. So this isn't surprising. But what it does tell us is that if a teenager or young adult is using e-cigarettes, that is a risk marker for other forms of substances. So it might give us an inroad to talk about or to intervene on these other types of substances, which we know, unlike e-cigarettes, we know that these other forms of substances have harmful effects. So I think that's where the key take-home message is there, that even if we don't know even if e-cigarettes are completely 100% physically safe, we know that they're linked to other substances. And we know through our research and through some other research that e-cigarettes precedes combustible cigarette use in many cases. And we, of course, know the negative physical health effects of combustible cigarettes. So again, even if e-cigarettes were completely harmless themselves, they are related to harmful products. If you could press the next one. So that's why we care. And I probably should have had Robert press that before I went on my speech. But the primary motivation here is that taste is better than regular cigarettes. So that's concerning, especially if you think about how they advertise to kids. And Robert's going to go on to this next slide here. And that's blank. And I apologize. Oh, wait, there it is. Okay. So you can see that gummy bear, e-liquid beer now. I'm okay with that. So, and there's Gwyneth Paltrow, who's a little bit nuts, but she is advertising e-cigarettes, and she's attractive. That's not Gwyneth Paltrow. That is stuff. So if you go to the next slide, so that's why we care about the flavor, because they're most of the flavors reported by our kids are fruit flavored. The ads are promoting various flavors, and that's why they use it, is because of the flavoring. And again, that could lead to combustible cigarette use. So if you go to the next slide, Robert, this is kind of more of the same, what you're about to see here, but it is now advertising as quit smoking. Picture of me, but that's not really me. I'm sure you guys figured that out. Vanilla cupcake, maple pancakes. So this is clearly meant to target adolescents. If you go to the next slide. So this is interesting too. We've done this before. We've been to this party before, and I think we're going to have to use some of the same tactics that we reduced combustible cigarettes on e-cigarettes. So if you go to the next slide, I think now we have questions and Robert, I don't know how you want to handle list. If you want to if you want me to go through the rest of the these slides and talk about recommendations or opening up for. All right, so we'll open it up for questions. So if you go to the next slide, so whether there idea is on 10 different problem behaviors. We have one comprehensive program that aims to make youth better citizens, less likely to do a number of substances, less likely to cyberbully or sex or whatever. Address e-cigarette use and prevention intervention programs. So existing prevention programs and intervention. And Robert, existing cigarette laws and policy. It's important for e-cigarette use because kids may see this as harmful, so they may be more likely to disclose e-cigarette use, and it was and I'm going through. Sorry, I'm going through these questions now, and I see that yes, absolutely, the slide presentation. Robert, please make that available for folks. Sorry to interrupt, Robert. Someone else mentioned, Detective Morgan mentioned that the problem is that kids are using the e-cigarettes to smoke marijuana and other drugs. Absolutely right. That is one of my hopefully I conveyed that in terms of it's not only e-cigarettes and those that are fun and low in nicotine. They're also using it for other drugs. Looks like a couple of folks are typing a question, so we'll wait on that. Oh, so that's a really good question. So do you know of any research on secondhand e-cigarette smokes? So what the no to the research, and if there is some, it's come out very recently. But what the experts are saying is that it really, once the vape gets let out into the air, it's consumed and exhaled. That it's basically like steam and gets dissolved in the atmosphere. And so the risk of secondhand smoke with e-cigarettes is probably negligible. But that being said, we don't really know because the research isn't completely, it's not comprehensive. It's not been done. So I don't know if that's even though I think it's negligible, that's not confirmed. And then Sandra asked about the flavors. Are they as potent as traditional, like menthol? There's been a call recently by the FDA to examine the flavors because there is some thinking that some of the flavoring might do more damage than other flavoring, and that's above my pay grade on figuring out which one might be worse. But there is some suggestion that some flavors could be worse than others, but I'm not sure of the details of that. There's a study by Adam Leventhal, Leaventhal. He's out of California. That really nice study that looked at e-cigarettes predicting combustible cigarette use as well. So it's a nice complement to this study. And it really does suggest that not only are they using e-cigarettes to smoke other drugs, but it does lead to combustible cigarette use. Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, and thank you all for giving me the attention. I really appreciate it, and I enjoy webinars. It's hard to see people. They're hard to talk sometimes when I don't get the nonverbals, but I have fun doing them, so I appreciate y'all sticking in there with me. Absolutely. Thanks all. Bye-bye.